This is Branko Malic from Kali Tribune with text-to-audio rendition of the article Against the Gnostics. The article is a critique of Alexander Dugin's fourth political theory. Alexander Dugin is controversial in a unique way. He seems to be reviled, praised, accepted, and rejected all at the same time. Nothing peculiar there if it weren't for the fact that these conflicting reactions can occur in conscience of single man reading single one of his books. In the following, we'll try to demonstrate why this is so, by attempting to digest Dugin's cocktail of contradictory ideas without getting too intoxicated, something which, unfortunately, happens to a good number of his readers in the West. Ideas underlying Dugin's sociological and political analysis on closer scrutiny appear to be contradictory to the point of insanity, in the sense not so dissimilar to insanity found in writings of ancient Gnostics, both in stylistic form and content. Dugin invites his readers to embrace chaos as he finalizes his pamphlet Politico-Philosophicus, titled The Fourth Political Theory, with a sermon in its praise. So, in the following, we'll proceed to scrutinize this book, but it will not be a close reading analysis, because Fourth Political Theory is so chaotic, so chock full of contradictions and of juxtaposing irreconcilable doctrines, from René Guénon to post-structuralism, that any kind of consequent interpretation would not do it justice. Alexander Dugin preaches chaos. As both sanitary measure and act of common courtesy, we'll let him have it, and in the process make an argument why it should be utterly rejected. Doubtless, as every self-respecting Gnostic, Dugin would be pleased to know he provokes an antiodromia in his reader's soul. An antiodromia in ancient Greek means the clash of opposites. After all, he sees himself as philosopher of radical new beginnings, and such endeavors require upheavals. You know the drill. Old vessels not fit for new wine must crumble. New world must rise on destruction of the old. Temples must be cleansed, etc., etc. Thus, a new beginnings philosopher usually gets dangerously close to being a prophet of curious, rather obscure, and accordingly rather confusing sort. Dugin's fourth political theory is as consciously prophetic and confusing an attempt at new beginning as it gets. Moreover, it is an invitation to a possibility of novel way of thinking and acting, the highly politicized, if not throughout politicizing what cannot and should not be politicized, new beginning, purportedly the either-or choice of destiny for contemporary men. Will he remain in history, or will he be bereft of it in an explosion of post-human freedom, erasing the time itself? Will he reclaim his right to exist as a finite being, endowed with the possibility of authenticity, a Dasein, as Dugin's mentor of choice Martin Heidegger called it, or will he simply sink beneath the event horizon of dying time at the end of history? Rather melodramatic propositions, don't you think? Well, I have a tremendous problem with melodrama in philosophy. There is something incredibly lazy in those apocalyptic notions coming from peak modern philosophers like Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, or Heidegger. They radically, a favorite word of theirs, reduce things to what they see as a historical destiny, to be affirmed and transcended in some kind of act that will bring about upheaval. Choice of eternity over finitude, revaluation of all values, or some other kind of semi-religious revelation of being in epochal ereignis, as Heidegger would have it. Ereignis is very hard to translate in English. The closest equivalent would be word enthrallment. Just a footnote there. They appear to be highly individualistic and consequently highly democratic in proclaiming their incurable insights as truths of the age, a message of destiny for all and no one. To an extent, Dugin fits in this typical modern and postmodern frame of mind, while at the same time seemingly advocating teachings like traditionalism, Christianity, and Platonism. In example, modes of thought and existence radically opposed to modernity and its melodramatic martyrs. He is apt in depicting the shortcomings of Western world. Necessary shortcomings, he would rightly add, but at the same time obscure about where exactly does he stand, and, as we shall see, necessarily so. It is no wonder that his insights on postmodernity awake interest in the West, because he can be an extremely discerning observer, endowed with genuine philosophical talent and willing to take a deep look into dark corners where few bother to even cast a glance. However, it is a contention of mine that Dugin's proclivity for taking deep looks into darkness has lesser to do with pursuit of truth than with hope of darkness looking back at him. A genuine, to an extent even sensual, love for this twin sister of original chaos, the ancient principle whose symbol he appropriated for banner of his Eurasian movement and for the title of last chapter of Fourth Political Theory, a most revealing essay named Metaphysics of Chaos. And this makes him extremely dangerous and profoundly misleading thinker and ideologue, one whose invitation must be utterly and irrevocably rejected. To argue the point, we'll stick to philosophy and not to geopolitics and sociological analysis, which is, unfortunately, rarely the case in approaching Dugin. Namely, the hint for understanding the core of Fourth Political Theory is to be found in Dugin's reverence of Martin Heidegger, whose term Dasein he accepts as subject of both his political analysis and political movement. Therein, in example, in Dugin's urge to go down to fundamentals the way Heidegger has done it before, with his own, as he calls it in one of his early essays, left-hand radicalism, lies his profound and mortally dangerous madness. The Fourth Political Theory, as Dugin would have it, is an invitation to completely and irrevocably reject the dead end of historical process he calls transition. This terminological peculiarity stands to his credit because its pejorative equivalent, globalization, is a rather misleading term. It gives a definitive, programmatic, and yet in some way messianic purpose to a process which is, as we can observe on everyday basis, not exactly clear about where it's heading. Moreover, globalization is commonly and mistakenly understood as spontaneous, progressive movement of humanity towards accepting certain definite social, economical, and metaphysical aims and values as forming principles of all societies across the globe. Nowadays, this movement is grinding to a halt, and, in its deceleration, reveals its true nature, in example, that it has never been spontaneous at all. Dugin rightly affirms that transition is therefore much better term than globalization, because it shows that the real purpose and the end of this process are in fact unknown and can only be conjectured. Globalization, on the other hand, is simply an attempt of the Euro-Atlantists bloc, led by USA, to impose its own purpose, its own political metaphysics, upon the rest of the globe. This process is, as it seems, progressively failing, and its programmatic forms are being dissolved. Transition is nevertheless afoot as a movement of dissolution of modernity, in example, so-called postmodernity. It is spontaneous insofar as it merely brings epochological presuppositions to their consequent resolutions. The best we can conjecture about its end is that it will necessarily be self-destructive, because of the contradictory nature of modernity it finalizes, and that it is essentially a process of dissolving time, more precisely, as this author explained elsewhere, of eradicating the past. The fourth political theory is a proposition of accepting this transition in a positive way and devising appropriate political theory and practice to exist in it. A proposition of molding one's own existence and the existence of political and social entities one belongs to in the form appropriate to transition, but in opposition to political metaphysics currently pushing it on. In this context, Dugin depicts, using somewhat Weberian ideal type approach, three political theories that struggled to rule the modernity. Those are liberalism, that is, first political theory, communism, second political theory, and fascism, third political theory. Only one of them is truly alive today, and it is liberalism, term which for Dugin encompasses ideological and metaphysical framework of all Western societies. It won the battle of 20th century against its two younger contenders and showed to be the only truly appropriate political philosophy of modernity. All three political philosophies have their respective subjects in the sense of underlying principle from and for which they came into existence. The subject of the first political theory is individuum. Second political theory relies on class, while the third political theory is a system built on race and or nation. These subjects are to be understood in the sense of both project and substance, in example, as both active purpose and the foundation of three contending metaphysics, in the respective senses of Greek word hypokeimenon and its Latin translation subjectum. For anyone in the know, this etymologizing approach already reeks of Heidegger and his phenomenological destruction of traditional ontology, an approach which, as we shall see, leads to philosophical suicide. However, Dugin, as well as Heidegger before him, has some good arguments for it. Namely, subject of political theory is a kind of image of man, a picture which imposes itself on a world and its humanity, contending that it is veritable and definite. The subject is, in this sense, a foundation for a possibility of systems of metaphysics. This is very important to stress. Metaphysics, as a political project, acts on much deeper, not so obvious level than mere ideology. In example, while ideology reflects existing state of affairs, metaphysics is an attempt of its rational foundation. Both the theoretical substratum and value system producing not only positive laws and institutions, but projecting a certain image of man, society, and world in general. This is political derivation of what Heidegger calls oblivion of ontological difference, necessary and inborn error of human thought which imposes identity on difference, extrapolating some singular being, say in political context, class or worker, and proclaiming it being in eminent sense, that by which is everything that is. So to develop and somewhat simplify the example, people leaning towards political left tend to beatify the worker and to demonize the spectral oppressor, while, as it is often remarked by their opponents from the right, most of them never met a living and breathing specimen of their political subject. However, this is entirely beside the point, because political metaphysics seeks to explain and rule the world, to systematize it, and its subject is truly a principle and purpose of power, not of compassion towards well-being of real people. Heidegger's understanding of ontological difference was, as we shall see later, more fundamental than this, but Dugin is pretty consequent in stretching the notion to politics and stating that political theories are in fact modes of political metaphysics. Unfortunately, he proceeds to draw the conclusion that there is no apolitical and transpolitical metaphysics, or a metaphysical or transmetaphysical politics too. And so we end up with free political theories imposing their principles on the world, fighting for supremacy to the death. Now, in the wake of 21st century, it is obvious that the winner was liberalism, the metaphysics of individuum. Its victory came about not by force of arms or even by subtle workings of economical and political warfare. It won because it deserved it. The modernity, as Dugin states, belongs to individuum because it is its logical and therefore rightful master. Some of the better passages in Dugin's fourth political theory concern depiction of this historical victor. The spectral, indivisible, and sacrosanct I of modern man. The individuum is a being whose substance is pure negative freedom from, in example, the absolute freedom of its reason and will to begin, become, and remain unconditional. On more superficial level of politics, it is expressed in liberal principle of autonomy of individual, be it economic, moral, or scientific. While contending for supremacy with other political theories, modern liberalism successfully kept its own principle in check, as an ideal, while trying to prevent them from enslaving it in the confines of class, nation, or race, and this struggle became the great narrative of freedom, the most widespread myth of 20th century. Moreover, the individuum and its struggle for liberation successfully fooled the humanity into belief that they represent man and his freedom, that the struggle is somehow natural, yet eschatological, process to be endorsed by anyone of sane reason and goodwill. They are, unfortunately, anything but. Individuum is a metaphysical construct, projection of certain historically conditioned image of man and his destiny, which in the end threatens to devour all other possible images and excrement them in its own form. Namely, individuum is a being without properties, or, better to say, being compulsively shedding its own properties to achieve total freedom. The ultimate aim being freedom from itself, in example, from every form of identity except the pure I. This abstract notion is something very real and can be observed now throughout the Western world in phenomena of institutionalization of every conceivable form of transgression, from beatification of homosexuality and legal empowerment of feminism to invoking the right to die or euthanasia. The purpose is metaphysical, namely, not to liberate the suffering, but to liberate the individuum by abolishing anything keeping it confined in some kind of limitation. Dugin claims that this tendency of liberalism was hidden from most in the second half of 20th century, mainly because it was contending with its enemies, who themselves were out-of-the-box totalitarian. However, if we take a closer look, it is astonishing how both younger political theories apply the same principles as the first. Perhaps the best example is the notion of race, now a dirty but curiously often used word throughout the media sphere of the West. This notion of human being, as in essence biologically preconditioned, pervaded the whole political spectrum of pre-World War II Western Europe and USA, seriously politically contended only by Catholic Church. It is a kind of modern-day inverted Platonism, seeking eternal incontingent, as well as compulsively striving for perfection of naturally imperfect. In this context, it is a little-known yet well-documented historical fact that eugenics is not a consequence and sort of offshoot of Darwinism, but its very purpose. As well as Darwin's work was inspired and preconceived by social theory we now anachronistically name social Darwinism, devised in outlines by Malthus and Herbert Spencer. Francis Galton, Carl Pearson, and Charles Davenport were not radicals, but junior fellow-travelers of Darwin. The similar applies to an astonishing extent to first women's rights, birth control, and euthanasia advocates, recruited both from the left and from the right. While in Europe race was somewhat overshadowed by the class, essentialist preconception of perfectible contingents of man lay at the foundation of both terms, making them even interchangeable to some extent. And precisely this contingent, one could argue, is what individuum really is, that of which, as old scholastics knew very well, there can be no real knowledge. The reason for this is the fact that the contingent is merely a kind of substratum to which intelligible form is predicated and cannot exist in itself. An amorphous matter, in truth just a logical boundary of what can be taught or said, quite similar to logical principles of non-contradiction or identity. Something we must presuppose to understand something real, but itself nevertheless completely unreal in itself. The notions of race and class give this murky pseudo-something an intelligible essence in the forms of quote-unquote law of inheritance or survival of the fittest or class struggle, making it a hidden substance of all political theories of modernity. Hence the victory of liberalism. It is a metaphysics which, with all power and clarity, adheres to fundamental principle of modernity and expresses its nothingness in its most pure and powerful form. Anyone in the know about Dugin's views would affirm that this line of thought is fairly along his lines. However, here this author must diverge. Dugin's answer to the challenge of individuum is the establishment of a being depicted by Martin Heidegger through his peculiar interpretation of German word Dasein. A literal, albeit Latin-tainted, English translation would be existence, in the unqualified, most common sense. But Heidegger gives it a novel spin. Dasein is a being for which to exist means to have a priori meaningful relation to being. The meaning, however, is commonly derived from its being thrown in the world. The German term is Geworfenheit, signifying the fact that all existence is a priori contingent. In example, pointed towards meaning, but originally meaningless. This paradox stems from the fact that eminent characteristic of Dasein is its necessity to choose or project the meaningful mode of its existence, but is unable to project its foundation and its ultimate end, its ultimate whence and where to. Dasein is not simply a man, as Heidegger is all too eager to point out, because the term man, in his view, always presupposes some preconceived meaning of what the man is, some unconscious metaphysical foundation. Here we can already glimpse why Dugin clings to Heidegger's phenomenological approach. Namely, if Dasein is taken as subject of political theory, then the space remains open for something that transcends the metaphysical constructs of free modern political theories. Dasein is a being which originally projected these images of man out of its own irksome and inauthentic existence. But by its very nature, there is always a possibility of authentic project, insofar as Dasein is always irreducibly mine. While there is a possibility of individuation, there is also possibility for new beginning, because there is always something that a priori rejects any meaning imposed from the outside. The principle of individuation, which makes Dasein what it is the absolutely certain possibility of death. This is the only context in which Heidegger uses the term absolute. Death is absolutely certain, but only as forever possible. It must be experienced as possibility and dealt with as possibility. And it is always mine. While everything can be appropriated in a world systems and world images of ruling metaphysics, man can never be bereft of his own death. The greatest possibility of Dasein's existence lies in inescapably certain possibility of its own inexistence. Well, how's that for melodrama? While Heidegger's thorough analysis from Sein und Zeit can provoke us to think that his fundamental ontology really is something fundamental, it is anything but. Namely, Dasein is je mein and a relationless possibility, in example, unrelated and unconditional reality of human being as individual, unrelated to any concrete man or woman, except maybe if we affirm that Dasein is in fact Heidegger himself. Dasein of Heidegger's philosophy is a historically conditioned being, but its historicity is transcendental in the sense that it is completely handed over to it, completely passive, due to its original nothingness. Moreover, the modes of its being depicted in Sein und Zeit, so-called Existentialen, as opposed to categories of traditional metaphysics, remain curiously unrelated to the world itself and other Daseins. This makes this poor hero of the wasteland of modernity curiously isolated in its own relation to nothingness, always inescapably possible, but never truly real. Heidegger was well aware of this fact, and in his later works endeavored to depict it from the higher standpoint of being itself. This means he tried to ditch the traditional philosophical terminology, still underlying his early works, and employ a sort of quasi-poetical language devised not to explain, infer, or clarify, but to show and indicate the truth, or as he calls it, in etymologizing the Greek term, being unhidden, or in Greek, aletheia. Needless to say, this language is extremely obscure, while the method itself prevents any semblance of critical approach from outside of Heidegger's own terminology. So we are treated with things like Ereignis or enthrallment of being, which we already mentioned, man as shepherd of being, language as a house of being, and in his posthumously published magnum opus Beitrage zur Philosophie, apparently especially close to Dugin's heart, we are treated with Last God, der letzte Gott, Geschichte des Seins, etc., etc. This makes Heidegger's thought, by its very design, at the same time elusive and labyrinthine, yet essentially completely hermetic, a kind of philosophical occultism, requiring completely counterintuitive initiation, which comes dangerously close to a philosophical equivalent of brainwashing. Moreover, he was extremely careful to ditch such expressions as soul, person, spirit, and above all, mind, all of them terms, indeed beings, without which philosophy is in fact impossible. Instead, he seeks some new, more original, more authentic ground out of which the new thought will arise and be expressed in the way understandable only to a specific kind of intellectual elite trained in the ways of phenomenological demonstration. And these wuthering heights of spiritual arrogance reach their rather slippery peak in Heidegger's approach to philosophical tradition, his interpretation of great thinkers of the past, the famous destruction of traditional ontology. Not to exhaust my readers with his minute and violent interpretations of Anaximander, Platon, Aristotle, or Hegel, we'll stick to his important lecture on Parmenides, called Satz der Identität, the principle of identity. Here Heidegger displays with crystal clarity just how misled is even the most profound thought of modernity when it tries to face the tradition proper. Namely, he argues that Parmenides' statement "togarauto noein estin te kai einai," or "for the same is the thought and to be," in fact expresses fundamental and necessary error of metaphysics. The identity of the same hides the moment of difference, denouncing it as nothing, the path which, as Parmenides states, should and in fact could not be taken by thought. For Heidegger, this is the moment when the idea of truth as correspondence of inference to reality is born, to be later developed by Platon. The identity is the only reality sought for, while the difference is banished to the realm of error, lie, and ultimately nothingness. Here he conveniently omits to note that Parmenides himself had a word for this ultimate otherness of being. He calls it night, or in Greek nux, precisely the mythical principle of Greek cosmogonies to which all ancient Greek philosophy bore conscious relation. It is the realm of which there can be no knowledge, but betwixt it and being proper there is a realm of illusion, where there are only opinions of quote-unquote two-headed mortals walking the quote road that always reverses upon itself. In example, the road that leads to chaos, the precipice, as is the original meaning of the word. While ancient tradition, including Parmenides, warned on diverting down this road, quote, upon which there is no certainty, Heidegger, somewhat like a poor coyote from old Roadrunner cartoon, is all too certain that he can traverse it, shedding in the process more than 2,500 years of philosophical tradition and its concepts. The identity of thought and being of Parmenides is for him nothing less than birth of modern technological thought, which reifies the beings and makes them as he calls it, ready to hand, zu Hande, in the form of Gestell, to be exploited and systematized in metaphysical systems of modernity. This Gestell means something along the lines of construction, but a skeletal construction. And by this, Heidegger, this all-embracing term for technological world and technological thought in Heidegger. This is ultimately the logos of the West, the tyrannical principle that imposes identity on difference, ever seeking to bring everything to light, be it light of divine reason or neon light of McDonald's rest stop. Here we are presented with astonishing lack of discernment characteristic of modern philosophers. To identify logos of Platonic and Christian tradition with measurement and quantification of contemporary techne displays precisely inability to point out what Heidegger purportedly likes best, the difference itself. All thorough Platonic scholars know very well that precisely interplay of identity and difference is an origin and the end of Platonism, as well as foundation of Christian theology, both in the East and in the West. Logos, being the origin of discernment, is both the principle of thought and being, but never a thing, a reified, systematized measurement tool, as Heidegger would have it. The very possibility of any kind of thinking, Heidegger's phenomenology included, is inconceivable without relation to it. And it is not true that Logos tyrannically excludes its radical other. On the contrary, the precipice of chaos is matter, or in Greek, hyle, the formless darkness haunted by its light, capable of nothing but reflection of it. As Proclo, one of the famous Neoplatonists from 5th century, once said, matter can exist only so far as it is held in existence by clinging to infinite power of God, because it is in itself ydehen, that is etymologizing the Greek word uden, which means nothing. Ydehen means not even one. Here we can deduce where Heidegger's and Dugin's Dasein stands. It is the completely isolated, contingent being unto death of modern man, bereft even of everything original but its death. Struck between metaphysics of total identity of individuum and total difference of its nothingness, two poles that comprise one and the same. Because it is clear as a day that Dasein, in fact, is individuum. The same negative freedom, burrowing in their respective essences, renders them the one and the same essence, only observed from different standpoint. While individuum projects itself everywhere, Dasein is forever retracting into its own nothingness, running from light evermore into its own darkness, in love with its reflections it provides. One passage from Croatian philosopher Marian Cipra illustrates this consequence of Heidegger's thought perfectly. Quote, as individual and contingent, this always mine existence is principally deprived of being and mind, and as such factually indemonstrable, while ontologically ineffable. Individuum est ineffable, as scholastics very well knew. There is no thought and no words of non-being, as Parmenid very well knew. The illusion with nothing at its base, a shine, shining in itself, is the dark shine emanating from Heidegger's philosophy. It is the deepest night that seeks to resolutely install itself as ultimate possibility of contemporary philosophy. As Parmenid would say, quote, now you'll hear my word on false order, where there reigns the dark night, its form laborious and heavy." End quote. And indeed, if we are to follow Heidegger, we must enter the dark night of illusion and bear upon ourselves his laborious heaviness. As for me, I feel no inclination to do it. And that's why I reject Heidegger with antipathy. I am pretty entschlossen about it. End quote. To return to Dugin, this is more or less what the subject of his fourth political theory should be. Much the same as Heidegger, he impresses the gullible with his rants against the modern world, but is in fact embracing it all too eagerly. The purpose of fourth political theory is not to reject, but to appropriate the transition. In this respect, it is astonishing how Dugin at one time can use René Guénon's insights to prove the destructiveness of Western political metaphysics, while just a few pages later he'll embrace the gender theory and its insights, quote, in quotes, insights, about, quote, unquote, death of phallocentric logos, in order to prove equality of civilization matrices ranging from Greek polis to cannibal village to be incorporated into multipolar world. To think in this way is possible precisely because the foundation of thought is a pure nothingness, building a virtual image of tradition while utterly rejecting it by its very nature. Thence, politicizing the metaphysics, bringing down angels to play geopolitical games, all peppered with peculiar orthodox nationalist mysticism, something this author, to his misfortune, recognizes all too well from bitter experience denied to his more fortunate Western readers. But at the same time, Alexander Dugin is important even as an unthinker, if for nothing else than to point out how melodramatic either-or choices are not the luxury we can safely enjoy these days. The fourth political theory is precisely such choice, but with somewhat exotic Gnostic spin, which renders it attractive but infinitely elusive as a mirage in the desert. To wrap things up, let's see what's so Gnostic about it. As Dugin's approach implies that there are no eternal truths in metaphysics or religious sense, we are permitted to invoke another kind of truths, not simply inventions of natural and social sciences, but something that lies not above reason, but beneath it. In his own words, quote, "We should postpone such notions as the dimension of spirit and the divine, and move towards chaos and other vertical and depth-oriented concepts." End quote. One could argue that to postpone doesn't mean to outright deny, but let's be careful here. Dasein is essentially being of noch nichts, or not yet. This means that it is essentially being of postponing, only projecting its reality, but always condemned to the modality of possibility. While, for instance, Plotinus talks of reversal of soul into itself, facing its temporality to reach its eternal root in spirit or mind, in Greek nous. In fact, making itself real by dissolving its accidental form, Dasein is always only reversing into its own nothingness, because the only form it has is the accident. While Christian interiorize the Logos by turning to what Saint Augustine calls interior man, interiore homine, Dasein is digging ever deeper into the abyss of its own insubstantiality, escaping the light towards darkness. The gullible reader, unfamiliar with traditional metaphysics and theology, can very, very easily fall into the trap of confusing what he feels to be his or her true self with what Heidegger and Dugin put forward as an invitation to possibility of unknown something. And that invitation leads straight down into the great precipice, into original chaos, the name ancient Greeks gave to unknown and forever unknowable nothing. In the Appendix 2 to the fourth political theory, named Metaphysics of Chaos, Dugin explicitly invites his reader to do just that. His argument is that there are in fact two kinds of chaos. The first, most obvious for us, postmodern men, is a postmodern chaos. It is a condition where time, above all past, is dissolved and history is rendered into virtuality, the insubstantial simulacrum of real world, where all one can do is contemplate infinite possibilities forever to remain unactualized. This is necessary consequence of the solution of modernity because its subject, the individuum, demands it. The absolute negative freedom is the freedom from the world itself. In example, the world itself must be rendered unreal as well as its essential elements: human body, ancestry, sex, and other potentially substantial limits of individuum. In this sense, for instance, posthumanist Ray Kurzweil insists that tattooing is a form of externalizing one's own body, preparing humans to merge with machines. The merging itself is a virtualization because it ditches reality for free project of oneself, admittedly cast in chrome and plastic, but still forever elusive and unreal, simply because it is coming about merely to affirm the otherness from oneself. It is, simply put, a contradictory absolute act of revoking contingency by making oneself absolutely contingent, an ultimate metaphysical escape from oneself. Now, if this post-humanist approach doesn't sound Gnostic enough to you, let us hear what Dugin proposes. There is namely another more original form of chaos. It is, in Dugin's opinion, the ancient primordial and ever-present origin of all, both gods and men, Mother Night, banished from history by the light of Logos, the primordial waters as they were before fiat lux of arrogant demiurgos. The absolute freedom encompassing all, including the errant Logos itself, to which we can return at every given moment by the deliberate embrace of its eternal possibility. This is the existential empire of Dasein, a condition where all semblances of rationality are ditched for the sake of absolute freedom towards death, the complete negation of actual for the sake of possible. In this sense, Dugin observes chaos as a sort of Platonic dynamis panton, an all-possible, eternal root of everything that is. However, he really inverts the order of principle of traditional metaphysics, as exposed both in Platonism and traditional Christian theology, and puts in the forefront that which is in fact the last and least of all. While Platonists' name for dynamis panton is the one ineffable, immaterial, and, in most eminent sense, supernatural origin of all, which is so all-encompassing and at the same time ever-present as to contain both ultimate possibility and ultimate actuality, Dugin takes for his principle its absolute other, the matter. This, in Platonic tradition proper, is a principle only insofar as it is a boundary of finite beings, but is taken in itself a pure submundane nothing, Mother Night negating all light, reason and reality, that which is absolutely below. It is the cosmic underworld, metaphysical catacombs for Gnostic to hide, not from the persecution of men, but from the world and their own conscience. In this sense, Dugin's fourth political theory is a typical form of left-hand Gnosticism, more or less identical with what we in the West call Satanism. Here's how he himself describes it in one of his early essays. And I quote, "The mankind has always had two types of spirituality, two paths, right-hand path and left-hand path. The first one is characterized by the positive attitude to the surrounding world. The world is seen as harmony, equilibrium, good, peace. All the evil is viewed as a particular case, a deviation from the norm, something inessential, transient, without deep transcendental reasons. A right-hand path is also called the way of milk. It doesn't hurt a person. It preserves him from radical experience, withdraws from immersion into suffering, from the nightmare of life. This is a false path. It leads into a dream. The one going by it will reach nowhere. The second path, the left-hand path, sees all in an inverted perspective. Not airy tranquility, but black suffering. Not silent calm, but torturous fiery drama of splitted life. This is a path of wine. It is destructive, terrible. Anger and violence reigns there. For the one who is going by this path, all reality is perceived as hell, as the ontological exile, as torture, as immersion in the heart of some inconceivable catastrophe originating from the heights of space. If in the first path everything seems as good, in the second as evil. This path is monstrously difficult, but only this path is true. It is easy to stumble on it, and it is even easier to perish. It guarantees nothing. It tempts nobody, but only this path is the true one. Who follows it will find glory and immortality. Who will withstand will conquer, will receive the award which is higher than life." End quote. Well, if there is something more appalling than melodramatic philosophy, it is melodramatic Satanism. For all the refinement of his later writings, this spirit of occultist left hand is demonstrably ever present throughout everything Alexander Dugin says or does. What he preaches is admittedly not posthumanism. On the contrary, it is no less ambitious subhumanism. It is an invitation to shed all semblance of humanity on the way down to regression into the waters of original chaos, dissolving body, soul, and mind into animal, subanimal, vegetable, subvegetable, mineral, and finally non-mineral world of absolute deprivation. This is, give or take, what for this discerning observer the hell should look like. Darkness in which only possible thought is a mirage, while its only possible utterance is onomatopoeia, cacophony of shrieks, ever being reduced into sounds of muddy waters boiling into silence. And this, dear reader, is the existential empire of Dugin's dreams. You are invited to it. After all, he knows how eager the Westerners are to escape the aberrations of their broken empires. But to escape fire by jumping into drained cesspool of original precipice, albeit decorated with images of dead Byzantine tranquility and endowed with Laibach soundtrack to make descent more cool, is a rather flimsy move, don't you think? Is posthuman versus subhuman really either-or choice? Is it really so melodramatic? I think not. It is no choice at all. Dasein has no choice. Individuum has no choice. Only the discerning human being can have a choice. And it is, as it intended was, from the dawn of the divine Logos, the ancient gesture Christians took from the oath-giving ritual of Roman soldiers, the gesture of waving no to the darkness, the ultimate no thanks applicable to all those strange men offering strange candy to spiritual children of non-spiritual age, an universal antidote against the Gnostics.